Just as a reminder also, in case you weren't on yesterday's show or haven't seen some of my emails, I put together this training video on how to complete the Small Business Administration disaster loan. Pretty disappointed, frankly, by what I'm seeing in the accounting community. I posted something on Facebook about this. There's a lot of folks who are calling around trying to sell these high-ticket accounting cleanups with sort of the lens that you need to have your books in perfect condition to be able to get approved for the SBA loan. Most of the time, I mean, they're doing approvals in 2 to 3 weeks is their timeline, and they're going to ask you for tax returns to validate prior numbers. We're not that far into this year. So most of the time, you probably can get your books in ample shape with some general journal entries to reconcile things. The deeper cleanups are usually necessary if you're going to go through due diligence to like sell your business, for example. So just be leery about people who are out there trying to sell and take advantage of the situation that we find ourselves in. So put together that training video, and really what it points out is that you can get really caught up in filling out all the individual forms where you're disclosing your assets and liabilities, all those sort of things. But really the most critical form, which in the sequence of the online application comes at the end, is providing your basis for why and how you were economically impacted, which this is usually where I find folks cut corners because they think, well, it's obvious because we're in a tough time right now. It's obvious that I would be economically impacted. And here's what my sales are for this month compared to last year. Isn't that sufficient? And really, if you want to set yourself apart, it's providing a lot more narrative and basis for it. What are your leads at usually compared to where they're at currently? And so on and so forth. So trying to provide as much data for how you are justifying this economic impact. So that's going to set you apart. It's also going to be justification for potentially more than somebody else might receive. No, Nick, did you have something to add onto that?
No, I'm not. I haven't even looked at the application, but it looks intimidating based on your video. So
so what I would say to that is that it's not too dissimilar from filling out a loan application to get a home loan. You got to provide all the basic information, your name, social security number, business name, tax ID, address, ownership breakdown, and then you've got to provide your personal assets and liabilities, so personal financial statements, and then you need to provide some trends around revenues and expenses over the last 3 years. So it's a lot of data, like it's time consuming. It's going to take a couple hours to get all the information onto the forms. But like I said, it's not much different than filling out a loan application to get a home mortgage or a line of credit. I also make the point that it may not be actually the highest priority for you. And that if you're going to fill out the application, try to do it early in the morning or later at night, because right now during business hours, the website is pretty slow, pretty unresponsive, I think, because so many people are trying to do it at once. So consider trying to do it earlier in the morning or later. As always, if you guys have questions, drop them in the comments, drop them in the Q&A. Nick will flag them, and since I'm typically not the best at keeping track of all that stuff. So dive into a few things. In addition to seeing some folks try to take advantage of the situation in terms of positioning SBA loan or disaster loan related products, I'm also just seeing a lot of generalized recession-proof talk. And I don't know if I said this last week, but ironically, I put together a recession-proof course the middle of last year, right? Was it June, July, Nick, that I put together this course? 9 people bought it, which included 0 of my 500 existing clients. I don't think a single client responded as part of the CPA firm with interest in it. Only one person showed up to the class. So a couple weeks in, we pivoted the course to more of a kind of done for you thing. But last year, everyone was telling me I was an idiot for talking about a recession and that it was unnecessary. And the thing about it is that I wasn't actually necessarily predicting a recession. There were some indicators that one could be happening, but you can always find some indexes that might support that that are not necessarily causation related indexes, meaning this happened so it's going to cause a recession. There are usually some correlation, meaning when there have been recessions in the past, this indicator has also been at a certain level, and so perhaps they're positively correlated. So ironically, I put together this course last year, and now I see a lot of marketing folks, business development folks, all trying to sell their own version of recession proofing. And I often get asked from folks, how do we create so many different offers? How many different angles did you put together from offers last year? It was like 783.
My
angles.
Yeah, my CO. I mean, you know my partner, my partner, the other Dan. That's what he does. His job is to just track what I'm doing that's working. I think he said 783 over 12 months. You made seven publicly that he could count 783 different angles. And we only sold like 2 different things, right? But 783 or 789 different angles, pitches that he could publicly find.
So when folks have this perspective that you're creating all these new programs and offers, or I have all these new programs and offers, it's misrepresentative, really, because they're just different angles on the same thing.
Yep.
So we're not building out new products. Really, we're just applying the same methodologies and same frameworks, just through a slightly different contextual frame. And so when we launched the cash flow engineering framework, I was able to put that together so quickly because I already had it just from the existing framework of how we build roadmaps for clients, and also through the existing frame of what we had layered in for the recession proofing methodology. So we're not trying to reinvent things. That's in particular because it comes back to this whole idea that as we grow our cash flows, we're trying to reduce our risk. And that every time we create something new, and I know I keep banging this drum over and over again, but every time we do something new, we're interjecting more uncertainty. And I always have the position that if something is new, I have zero expectation of the outcome, which I think is defeating to some folks. Like Nick will tell me about you'll tell me about like a new face. This happened over the weekend, right? You told me we launched well, maybe you can tell the story.
Well, we launched some ads, some Facebook ads.
Hooray.
And that's the, again, it goes back to 783 angles in a year, right? The expectation is that I throw out 700 messages. 2 of them might make millions of dollars. It's awesome. But I think the assumption is that I made 2, right? I made 2 offers and both were home runs. Yep. And so people set up expectations that like, or you see people screenshot their ads. You see it on Facebook all the time where like they pick an ad set and they screenshot it and they're like, look how good my ads are. Well, they often don't show is the 500 ad sets that didn't work before that. So we have the expectation that, cool, we launched ads. Let's just look at the bank account and wait for the money to come in because we did the thing.
Exactly.
And I get all the time, Dan and I go back and forth. Everybody, it's like, when's the money coming in? Like, didn't we launch an ad? Like, yeah, we launched one of many, many, many because we don't know. It's unknown. It's a new thing.
Yeah, we don't have the data because it's new. We don't have the data to support any expectation. And the most conservative thing to do is to do what you know today. Right now, we don't know anything other than that the house usually wins. So Facebook usually wins and they get paid no matter what. and we don't necessarily generate sales or the results that we would like. So distinguishing between what we would like and what we expect are totally different, at least in my mind. And so, because it all comes back to the preponderance of data. So I don't speculate on what might happen when I don't have the data to support that. And it goes back to what Randy said yesterday about the difference between an Epicurean and a Stoic. And he provided, 2,000 years worth of contextual framework around how the Epicurean tends to be really caught up in all the vanity stuff, the vanity metrics, and the niceties of life. And that's not to say that you shouldn't enjoy those things. Meanwhile, the Stoic is out planting seeds and preparing with a level head for the future. And what ends up happening is that in downtimes, the Stoic is well prepared and the Epicurean is not. And we know that in lots of parables that exist out there, in children's books and so on and so forth. But we time and time again tend to repeat the sins of the past and get too caught up in those vanity metrics. So here's the methodology to recession-proof, and it's the same methodology that I call the profit priority. It's what we're going to use for our when we get to it, our next class on how to pivot your business. We've also teased that we have a methodology for how to retire your parents that we planned on starting last week until we switched gears on talking more about how to seek certainty and bringing on guests and such. But they're all the same methodologies. It goes back in sequential order to understanding your position, understanding your priorities, optimizing, and then recalibrating. And so the engine that powers all of this is understanding a couple of critical things. And Nick, I'm going to ask you to jump in and share some of your perspective on it.
Mm-hmm.
So, number one, when we're evaluating our position, our priorities, when we're going through the optimization phase, when we're going through the recalibration phase, the issues, the situations, the matters that we're looking at, are they a fact versus fiction issue, or are they a preference? Fact versus fiction, right or wrong, versus preference. And so maybe not most of you, but I'll use the royal you, most of you are spending too much time focusing on things as if they are through the fact versus fiction lens, when in fact, most of the things that we face, I would argue, are preferences. Do I want to grow? Do I not? Do I want more free time? Do I want to buy a vacation home? Should I hire employees? Should I not hire employees? Should I do contractors? Should I move? Should I go buy a farm? I mean, so on and so forth. All preferences. The problem is that you're trying to solve the problem for the preference as if it's a fact versus fiction. But clearly we couldn't just go Google, should I buy a vacation home, and get an actual answer that would work for us. So we're spending too much time we have to isolate, is this actually a fact versus fiction? Because if it is, we should just go Google potentially and get the data to support the conclusion. And so the hack that I try to use to move through this, because it's easy to get hung up both in an internal argument with yourself, but also with your business partners and vendors and so on and so forth, is if I'm in this conversation, which I have conversations with myself all the time, if we're arguing about fact versus preference and we both can't agree, because this actually happens quite a bit where people are like, no, this is a fact. And you're like, no, I don't think this is a preference. And so my hack is to go, if we can't agree on if this is a fact or if this is preference, then my default is necessarily that it's a preference.
Yep.
Inherently, by virtue of the fact that we cannot conclude on whether it's fact versus fiction or preference, to me means that it is therefore a preference. And so, but most of us are defaulting to it's a fact. your views on the economy, your views on all these sort of things. So fact versus fiction can be solved through data. Preferences can only really be solved through personal indexing. What is it that you want, you need? And so again, Randy touched on it yesterday, the difference between personal indexing and group indexing. Group indexing is looking at some group. Maybe he used the example of having higher blood pressure and getting prescribed some medication to reduce his blood pressure. But in actuality, for his specific scenario, that was the worst thing for him, because then all of a sudden he was passing out and lightheaded and all these other things. So it was based off group indexing of looking at his age, his race, and his gender, and going, well, based off your blood pressure right now, you need this medication. Whereas personal indexing is looking at your unique biorhythms, your business's unique biorhythms, the things that you want. So it's more of a biology view on things. Nick, I know we've talked about this a lot, so anything you want to add on?
I'll just add that I'm really happy you use that example, because I've never heard him use that before, and that's the one I always go to, because I was introduced to all of this in the context of biology, and it's the group indexing is it's dangerous, right? There's a lot of things. I was just reading this morning, and it said, compare yourself to yourself yesterday, not to everybody else today. And that's a big thing. Like, is it right or wrong that I'm doing this much revenue and this much profit, right? Like, am I good or bad? Well, I don't know. What were you doing yesterday? Are you improving or not? And that's really the question that we're trying to get to, right? Is are we improving? Are we getting closer to the things that matter? So it's that snapshot in time, especially when you compare it to other people, that causes a ton of stress and anxiety, and we start making really poor decisions when we group index like that.
So we need to solve what our preferences are. We need to default to personal indexing, and then to work through navigating the answers to those preferences is where the principles really come in. Things like, first we optimize them, we maximize. We always hedge the downside risk the most. We're not going to speculate on the future. We're going to use the data that we have today. Those are examples. We bias towards T-learning over I-learning. We bias towards personal indexing over group indexing. These are examples of the principles that we can use to navigate through solving what our real preferences are and how to move forward. So that's the first engine that powers all this this methodology. The other engine is being able to delineate between when you're the marketer frame versus the professional skeptic frame. And you need to be able to use both. And what I've noticed is that the modern entrepreneur has this proclivity towards just viewing things through the marketer frame. And so what I mean by the marketer frame is that they're identifying revenue risks. I don't have enough leads. I have inconsistent leads. I have low revenue per client. And the conclusions from that are like, well, I need to do more marketing, or I need to launch some new products. And so again, every time we do something new, though, we're introducing new volatility into our business. And so new and more is not necessarily the answer, but the marketer frame almost always takes us there. So we have to layer in, and that's not to say that it's not true. Sometimes you do need more leads, or you have inconsistent lead flow and all of that. But we also have to layer in the professional skeptic, which is almost like the Socratic method. Professional skeptic is one of the underpinnings of being a CPA, which is if you're trying to evaluate something from being free of material misstatements, what you might say is accurate. You have to be aware of the fact that the thing that you're evaluating, a person or a system, might not be giving you all the answers that you need. Those answers might not be complete. They might not be consistent. They might not relate to the right period that you're examining. And so the professional skeptic asks questions like, does revenue spike at a certain time throughout the year? And is that just because of the nature of the industry? Or is it because of something I'm actually doing to contribute to that? And so they'll look for correlations or causes for spikes in sales. They might also go, hey, the actual reason why we're not profitable is that when we bring in these sales in episodically, where we have 1 month of really high sales, that actually what we're doing is we're crushing the operational efficiency of our business. And so the cost to actually deliver on this work, the way that we have things set up right now, operationally is too expensive. Or they might identify that the nature of the sales don't align with the skills of the team that they have in place. Or, and we've talked about this quite a bit in the whole cash flow engineering series, is that when we have a jump in sales in the 2 to 3 months that follow, those tend to be the months that we bring on the most amount of expenses, because we're overgeneralizing and extrapolating out 1 month to be representative of what the future might be. So the professional skeptic is asking those sort of questions about their business. And so those are the lenses. Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, I'll give you a quick example because I got to jump in 3 minutes. Just had an emergency call with a client last week who did an interview with Grant Cardone, and then it went into this process, right? She has this process of editing videos and all that stuff. Whenever it dropped 3, 4, 5 weeks later, huge spike in applications and sales calls. Took on $6,000 a month in expenses because, oh, hey, look at all this coming in. We're going to be rich, right? Like they extrapolated it out. We're not able to immediately tie it back to the fact that it was an interview they did 6 weeks ago. Took on all these expenses. The emergency call was like, holy crap, what do I do? Now I have to fire all these people. Because all those applications and all that was actually from this one interview that I cannot repeat. I have no control over that. But the assumption was that this volume would continue for the rest of the year, maybe the rest of all time. So even though it's great when you go viral, it's great when you get a huge influx of business, the response was, hey, hire sales team. We got to handle all this volume. We're taking the next step in our business. You know, we're pushing past whatever ceiling. And then I got an emergency call because they were in perhaps the worst place they've been in a very long time. And then there was the uncomfortability of like, now I got to fire all these people I just hired. So a perfect example of seeing that influx and not understanding it was an episodic thing and taking on a ton of expenses because they've extrapolated out that little tiny period of time and assumed it was going to continue for, indefinitely.
Right. Yeah, good example. So in order for us to go through the methodology when we're thinking about recession proofing, we have to be able, which is understanding our current position, then our priorities, then optimizing, then recalibrating. We have to be able to distinguish between what is fact versus fiction versus what is a preference. And we have to be able to look at things both through a marketer frame and professional skeptic frame. So you have to be able to be in that mindset to actually do this analysis appropriately, which means maybe you need to go for a run. Maybe you need to tap out from social media for a few hours. Maybe you need to journal. Maybe you need to meditate. Whatever it is going to take you to a place where you're not riding some dopamine hit where you're going to throw out a bunch of arbitrary goals and targets and all that. So we need to be in a relatively kind of blanking on the best descriptor, but a relatively balanced state. At that point, we can go through, and I'm just going to summarize this, and then since we don't have a guest on tomorrow, and again, Thursday, we have the expert on sleep. With respect to position, what are your assets and liabilities? And you need to look at currently, and you need to look at any accruals. So things like accounts receivable, accounts payable. What is your current run rate? So meaning without changing anything, what are your current committed revenues and your current total expenses per month? And then what are the risks that you face? And I would recommend that you go through each line of your business, marketing, sales, operations, HR, so on and so forth. And each line of the business, and look at what is the worst case and what are the best case scenarios. So some of the risks that exist for folks right now is if this thing turns in a couple of months, are you going to be able to catch the wave, the upward wave? So while you're cutting things out because of the downturn, can you also be in a position to catch the wave if and when there's a rebound? And so the risk is that you're not in that position to be able to gear back up. And so how are you going to hedge those risks? So if we hedge the downside and we hedge the upside, we create in derivatives, and that's my background from the past, we create what's called a collar. And a collar is where we're basically locking in our gains. So when I worked at Deloitte on the Microsoft engagement, they had $100 billion in investable assets. And what they did is they executed in the Treasury Department a lot of collars around foreign sales, so non-US sales, and a huge multinational, obviously Microsoft. And so what we're trying to do is eliminate foreign currency risk because they ultimately need to restate everything in US dollars. And so what is the risk that the dollar devalues relative to these other currencies? And then, so we want to eliminate that risk, but also we don't want all the volatility in the other direction. And so actually what we want to do is we just want to be able to lock in sales at the current exchange rate between US dollar and whatever that currency is. And so they would buy this derivative contract. It was a basket of, I don't remember, 40 different currencies. That was a collar that would lock in the gain. And so just by way of analogy, what we're trying to do in analyzing and looking at each line of business is what's the worst case scenarios, what are the best case, and ultimately if we hedge the downside risks of all the worst case, and also we can hedge the downsides associated with the best case, and essentially what we're doing is we're trying to lock in the gains. Let me know if that makes sense. Happy to talk to you guys on a one-on-one basis about that stuff. Then we look at our priorities. What is it that we're really trying to fund? Number one priority, number two, number three, number four. Usually people have 5 to 7. If you got more than 10, that may be too much. Usually 5 to 7. And what is number one priority, number two, number three? What is it going to cost to fund each of those priorities? And what is your target timeline? What that's doing is it's creating guardrails, because what we're going to do is we're just going to optimize towards our number one priority. We don't have the resources or time to optimize towards these 8, 10 different priorities. We're going to optimize to number one. The reason why that's a guardrail is that I get a lot of these questions from folks right now about should I be putting money into the market because it's down and maybe it's at the floor. I don't know if it's at the floor, but and it would be easy to just go, well, yeah, if you've got money on the sidelines, put the money in and let's invest and let's average it out over 12 weeks. So take whatever money you have and divide it by 12 and put it in each week over the next 12 weeks, which if you actually have that money, that would be the approach that I would use. But that's not the point. The point is that how do you know if that's the right answer or the right question to be asking? Back to fact versus fiction versus preference. Putting money into the market right now is not a fact versus fiction, it's a preference. And so you have to be able to isolate if this is actually the number one priority for you. And so if your number one priority is financial stability, and putting money into the market right now is not going to provide that. And so if that is your number one, it's not going to provide it. Why? Go search the VIX index, VIX, Google VIX. It's an index based on future contracts, and it's basically a proxy for how much risk there is in the market. It's at 60 right now. So you could have predicted that the market would bounce a little bit today because it's been at 70 to 80, and it's dropped a bit recently. But 60 is extremely high as contextual frameworks, basically from 0 to 100. Prior to last week, I think we've had 3 days ever And it was during the global financial meltdown where VIX was over 75. And if you look at the chart, we had several days last week where it was in the mid 70s to it peaked at 80, almost 85. And now we've leveled off and we're more in the 60s. But historically, it's in the 20s. So again, it's a measure of volatility. So if your number one priority is financial stability right now, taking this money that you have and throwing it into the market, speculating is not going to give you financial stability in the short term. So you need to get really clear. If your number one priority is long-term investing and expediting my ability to retire, and I feel like I have enough savings to weather this storm, then under that scenario, you may have the bandwidth to then invest in the market. But this is where getting really, really clear on rank ordering your priorities is, in my opinion, of utmost importance. Then we actually move to optimizing, and that's what I'll cover tomorrow. Optimizing is basically our whole cash flow engineering methodology. That's part of it. But it starts with really compiling specific details about our revenues and expenses so that we can analyze and strategize. And the strategy part is where we're identifying the opportunities that we might explore. And so this process is really intentional, position priorities optimizing, because it goes back to fact versus fiction preference, and the whole marketer frame is that a lot of folks right now are creating a tremendous amount of additional volatility for themselves, self-inflicted, because they're launching all these new products and all these other new things to try to ride a wave, and it may not actually be serving them appropriately. So with that, I'll see you guys tomorrow. Although Christy asked, would it be advisable to purchase assets during this time, like real estate? I'll take a screenshot of these questions and I'll answer them tomorrow. So I appreciate you all tuning in, and hit me up with questions. And Christy, if you want more immediate answer than tomorrow, feel free to email me as well. Otherwise, appreciate everyone. Be well, and hopefully I'll see you tomorrow.